So today we're going to talk about the United States Constitution. We're not going to get into the amendments today. We're just going to look at the original 7 articles from 1788 that will be ratified and set the basis of the federal government. Now, it is important to note that there is an agreement made which helps this document get ratified, which is an agreement that the first Congress will take up a Bill of Rights to be passed, and that will be the first 10 amendments to the Constitution. But for this presentation, we're just simply going to look at the 7 articles that make up the Constitution. Article 1 sets up the most powerful branch of the federal government, that's Congress, the legislative branch. In Article 1, you will see the description of Congress, which is Congress will be the branch that makes the law. So they will draft bills. Bills will pass through both houses. And if that bill then is signed by the president, it will become law. But the making law power is the most powerful power given over to the government. Throughout this article, you will see the description of the structure, which will be 2 houses of House of Representatives, which will have representatives based on the population of a state, and the Senate, which will have representatives just given 2 representatives per state. So that's just an equal representative model. You also see the qualifications to serve in both houses. So to be a representative, you must be 25 years old and a citizen of your state for 7 years. And to be a senator, you must be 30 years old and a citizen of your state for 9 years. Also, a representative serves a 2-year term, while the senator serves a 6-year term. And also, because there are fewer members in the Senate, it is a more prestigious office. Just think about if you were one of 100 people, you would have a lot more power than you would being one of 485. And so that's why that's a more prestigious office. You will find Article 1 will be much longer than Article 2 and Article 3 because, again, Congress is the most powerful branch of government given the power to make the law. So Article 1, Section 8 will give you a description there of what the actual powers are of Congress. Next, Article 2, the presidency or the executive branch. In this article, you will see the powers, duties of the president. You will also see the method of selecting the president. So this is where you're going to see the general description of the Electoral College, which will be modified later on, but this is where the basic setup is. And also it will require that the president is 35 years old and a natural born citizen. A few things to remember is that the executive branch will execute the law. So this is the branch that will enforce the law. There's also, again, a description of some of the other powers that they have. They will also have the commander-in-chief power of the military, which if there was some kind of military engagement and those decisions were to be made, they would ultimately be made by the president. Also, of course, he has to sign a law to execute it, to put it into action. The president also has the power to negotiate treaties. So this head executive, the unified executive that falls under one person. Now, Washington will set up a cabinet that we still have in place today. Over time, there will be a bureaucracy that will grow around the executive branch, so it will continue to grow. But at its core, the executive is run by one individual. That is the president. Everything flows through him or her. That is where the ultimate power resides. So of all the branches of government, this is the one that actually has a clear leader, and that is very intentional. You'll see that in the Federalist Papers, that they thought there had to be one executive, that at some point there had to be one person making a decision on executing the law, and that power falls under the office of the presidency. Article 3 sets up a Supreme Court, and well, it sets up the judicial branch and the court system, which ultimately it really just sets up the Supreme Court. It states that there will be a Chief Justice, does not say how many other justices there will be, and it says that Congress has the power to establish lower courts. It doesn't say how many there has to be. Doesn't even say there has to be any. He just says that Congress will establish them or can establish them. It also talks about what cases will have original jurisdiction or appellate jurisdiction for the Supreme Court. So it tells you the basic cases that they will hear, and talks about they will hear cases of controversies that arise underneath the law. So you've heard that, again, the legislator makes the law, the executive enforces the law, and the judiciary ultimately applies the law to the individual. So in a certain case or where something is unclear, a judge can step in and clarify the way that that law was meant to apply to that individual person. So it's your most technical branch. They're really the ones that are not really in the policy front as this kind of was originally set up. Now, over time, we've seen some of their rulings have had a significant impact on national policy, but early on, we see in the beginning of American history, a lot of their rulings are really in the weeds, just really technical rulings. But again, we see kind of a shift in the 20th century where we begin to see the court's powers, where the courts take on broader cases and apply them in a much broader sense, their rulings. But in the Constitution itself, it doesn't even tell you how many members of the Supreme Court there will be. That will be set up by the Judiciary Act in 1789. That really is your major legislation that sets up how many courts there will be, what will the Supreme Court look like. Article 4 is describing federalism, and by that, what is meant is that there's a full faith and credit clause there that says, listen, states have to respect the proceedings of another state. So if there's a judicial ruling, if there's certain records, these have to be respected across state lines. So it says that has to be respected. It also says that non-residents of a state shall have the same legal rights as residents. So basically, you can't pass a law that says this is illegal, this is legal unless in the state of Oklahoma, this is illegal for everyone in the state of Oklahoma unless you were to be from the state of Arkansas and come into Oklahoma, then it's illegal for you. You can't do that. It's got to be equal application of the laws. Then it describes what is required for a new state to come into the union, and it also protects the protection of the states, in which it says that every state has to have a republican form of government. It does not describe what that government has to look like. So states could actually technically have different types of government, but they have to allow their people to vote on what those offices look like. They are to be protected from invasion by the federal government and from domestic violence from state to state or inside a state violence as well. That is part of the protection that's guaranteed here as being a part of this new federal government. Article 5 sets up the amendment procedure. So if you wanted to amend the Constitution, what would that look like? The founders were very clear that, listen, the Constitution over time, you might want to add more to it. They are actually going to be very clear that there might be situations arise in which you want to change part of what we've done. That doesn't they didn't have an issue with it, but they did want to make that to be difficult to do so that there was broad agreement on what that would look like. So you could ultimately propose amendments by a 2/3 vote of both houses of Congress, then have 2/3 or have 2/3 of state legislators call a convention. So either way, you either have 2/3 of both houses propose an amendment or 2/3 of state legislators. And then if you want to actually amend the Constitution, you have to have 3/4 of state legislators, or at a ratifying convention, 3/4 of the states. Those are, your two ways of doing it, either through Congress and then state legislators, or through a convention of state legislators and a ratifying convention. Article 6 has some kind of finishing details of clearing up some things that might have not been clear towards the end of the constitutional debates here on who's responsible for what debts, that states would not be able to necessarily kick all of their debts back to the federal government. But there were some states, or there's some debts that would be assumed by the federal government. Most importantly, it really sets up the supremacy clause, which the supremacy clause found in Article 6 describes the order in this way: that the Constitution is above everything. Constitution is above every other type of government action. Constitution is on top. Underneath that would be a federal law. Then underneath that would be a state law. So for instance, if a state law and a federal law differed, the federal law would actually trump the state law. But if the Constitution trumped a federal law, that federal law would be null and void. So the Constitution is first. That's why we are a constitutional republic. You can't pass any law you want. Your elected officials cannot pass any law that they would desire. They have to pass laws that fall under their constitutional powers. If they don't do that, that would be outside that ranking of supremacy there, and the Constitution would be more powerful than the law that was passed that violated it. And then it sets up the oaths of office. So when you have a federal official, even your governors do this, they swear to uphold the Constitution of the United States. And that ensures that legally they have agreed to this government as it is set up. Article 7 simply describes what the ratification process will look like. So how will this document actually become the governing document of the United States? So to finish up, what are the major principles that we find here in the Constitution? The first is popular sovereignty, rule of the people. It is very clear the Constitution sets up that the will of the people will be respected. The legislators, the House of Representatives is directly elected by the people. The Senate is selected by the state legislature, which was elected by the people. The Electoral College elects the president, which again is chosen by the states. The will of the people will rule. The next major principle of the Constitution is federalism, that there's only certain powers given to the federal government and that the states are respected underneath that there's a system. You have the federal government, then you have your state government, then you even have a more local government than that. That breaks up government into these layers of federalism. So depending on what specific issue there is, it could be handled at those different levels. Then brilliantly, the separation of powers, that the founders read the works of Charles de Montesquieu, John Locke, and were very concerned about what would happen if all the power was accumulated in one branch of government. So what they did was they made sure that the group of people that make the law aren't the people who enforce the law, and they're not the people who apply the law to the individual. Again, you can imagine a situation where if the same person who made the law also enforced the law, how quickly that could turn into tyranny. But the reality is you write a law in Congress and it's up to the president and the executive branch to execute that law. So it makes it much more difficult to be tyrannical. It makes it much more difficult for one group of people to come to power. And notice how each of those offices are elected differently. The House of Representatives is elected differently than the Senate, that's elected differently than the president. This is very intentional. Madison writes in the Federalist Papers that this was intentionally done to prevent factions from coming into power, so that one group of people couldn't control all offices, or if they did, it would be incredibly difficult to do. And then along those lines, another core principle is the checks and balances, that not only is power separated, but each of those powers are given the ability to check and balance out the other branches of office. For example, if the president doesn't like a law that was passed, he can block the bill from from becoming a law by vetoing that bill. That is a check he has on Congress. Now, Congress can check the president, for one example, if they could actually impeach the president. So that's a check they obviously have on the president of the United States. So that's the way that the separation of powers, meaning the powers are separated there between the three branches, but then there's also the ability for those separate branches to check each other and balance each other out. Another one is a principle of judicial review, which is going to come into play as we go, which means that the judicial branch will ultimately determine in a controversy how a law is applied to that individual person. So there is that last ability for someone who feels like a law is not being fairly applied to them, can ask for a judge to step in and grant them judgment. So that does give them one last chance if they feel like the government is not treating them appropriately or within the law to ask for that respite there from a judge. And lastly, the last principle that I'm going to mention today is limited government. It's very clear here in the way that these 7 articles are set up that the government can only do specific things. The government they were putting into place did not have unlimited power. It could not do anything that it wanted. There were only certain things that the government could do. This they felt was a very important principle because they felt it was very different from what they had seen in Europe and what they had seen in world history. They felt like only giving the government certain powers, separating those powers, setting those powers against each other in the way that they could check each other, would ultimately keep the American government from going down the road of tyranny that they'd seen time and time again in world history. So I hope this helped maybe clarify and give a simple overview of the Constitution and what those 7 articles look like.